Over 1,000 Google employees are demanding that the company take real steps to dismantle racism. They're circulating an internal petition saying that they're disappointed in the tech giant's response to the protests over police brutality. CNBC tech reporter Jennifer Elias joins us now. And Jennifer, the petition says that saying Black Lives Matter is not enough. What specifically are they asking Google to do here?
So the employees signing this petition are asking the company to cut off contracts it has with law enforcement. And they note one specifically, its Google Cloud subsidiary has multiple contracts with military as well as law enforcement. Clarkstown Police Department is one that it notes, which is based out of New York. It's which a partnership the company is touted and uses a number of the company's products such as G Suite, Gmail, and whatnot. So employees are asking them to cut off those contracts. They're also asking for the company to cut off investment from its investment arms, such as Gradient Ventures, which is one of the venture arms, a part of Google. And they have a number of companies in its portfolio that do things like use data analytics for battlefield information, also providing law enforcement with some data. So they're also asking to cut off those investments.
I know Amazon and Microsoft recently stopped selling their facial recognition technology to the police. What's Google saying about its artificial intelligence tech?
So they haven't pointed specifically to artificial intelligence more broadly, but they have said, in their response to our article on this, they had said, we aren't selling facial recognition to authorities like Microsoft and Amazon were doing. So it's interesting that they kind of fit that in there, but they haven't said more broadly, what they're doing with artificial intelligence. Specifically, they still have the contracts, basically, is what we know, and they still have artificial intelligence contracts with military and with law enforcement.
Last week, Google said it would put $175 million towards supporting Black businesses. Do we know what else the company is doing?
Yeah, the company is, aside from the monetary commitments, they're also making a few tweaks internally to how they kind of treat employees. They did a number of supposed listening sessions with some of their Black employees. They've made a couple changes. They've vowed to increase the underrepresented people in leadership positions. Now, that doesn't mean specifically Black employees, so there's a little bit of a qualm there because that could mean a number of different things. But they've also ended policies like peer badge checks, which they said after coronavirus, they can allow employees back on the office, that they won't be enforcing the policy where colleagues actually have had to check each other's badges, which has resulted in the low percentage of Black employees feeling even more isolated than they are because employees would constantly check their bags and not believe that they work there.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.